Thank you, Mr. Kennedy, for being with us today.
Thank you, Simone.
Australia just signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative not too long ago. And how is this going to impact the Five Eye country, the Five Eye cooperation?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that's a short-term mistake on the Australians' part. The Belt and Road Initiative could only co-opt Australia and Australian businesses into what the PRC is trying to do with their Belt and Road Initiative, which is to exert outlying political and economic pressure on a country to become part of the, as it were, Chinese bloc. And I think the Australians have made a short-term mistake in signing on to it, and one hopes that they correct that over time and see that such investment by the PRC and such cooperation with the PRC is not in their long-term economic interest. Because almost everywhere the PRC goes, under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, they find ways of corrupting the political and business elites of those nations that they do business with.
Exactly.
And so that's very problematic.
Right. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson just kind of vetoed President Trump by saying, we're not going to rule out Huawei for our 5G deployment. What do you make of it?
Yes, again, I think that's very short-sighted on the part of the British.
Right. Do you think those things can be corrected, or once it's settled, how is it going to be corrected later on?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's very difficult to be corrected. After a while, some of these things seem inevitable. China's big. They have these, corporations that are very technologically advanced. They have all these business relationships. Why fight it? Why not just go along with it? And Huawei seems cutting edge, and they're such nice people, and it seems like such a good company, and everybody's smiling and happy, and there's so much money to be made. Why not just go along? Until you realize that Huawei, given their technological advantage in all this, is going to build a telecom system that will essentially allow the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party to look at any business within Great Britain that is part of that system. And that is not to the advantage of the British people. Yes, they may be big, they may be technologically advanced, but it's not inevitable. You could build a different kind of system. You need to build a different kind of system. We're living in the age of intellectual property. Like, what do we create in the West other than intellectual property?
Nothing.
We build things, right? We build homes, we build roads, we build cars. But intellectual property is really the thing that's being developed in the West. Now, why would you let a country like the PRC, because it's ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, let me just say, why would you give them the technological edge to be able to look into all the intellectual property that you are producing, when you know for a fact that they steal intellectual property? Why would you give them an open door to do that? That makes no sense. And so there's a certain disconnect among our political and economic elites. They don't want to recognize what the Chinese threat really is. And that's the ongoing theft of intellectual property. Not to mention whatever military and other problems the Chinese Communist Party may present. The theft of intellectual property alone. In the United States, we put that number, the President, Secretary of Commerce have put that number at almost $5 trillion
Right.
over the last decade. $5 trillion of American wealth. And so you're going to continue to export your wealth to the PRC, or you're going to stop it. And if our cousins in Great Britain wish to do the same, bad for them.
Mm-hmm. When things like that happen, when things that just totally doesn't make sense happen, make people wonder, how does politics work? I want to get your opinion how American politics works in terms of foreign policy. For example, what does it take to have a foreign policy overhaul, such as with China right now? Is it a top-down process, or is it bottom-up process? Who dominates it?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. It's very difficult to reform foreign policy. it's very difficult to see some of these things. Because when a nation becomes intellectually and morally corrupt, it's hard to see, people with common sense look at something and they think, well, why would we do that? Why would we give money or, give money to certain nations who don't like us? Why would we not crack down on the PRC when it comes to the theft of intellectual property? When you look at it from a top down or bottom up, it's both in America.
Okay.
Top down in the sense that you had President Trump. He saw the theft of intellectual property. He saw bad trade deals. On the one hand, that's at the top. And then, from the bottom up, the American people saw that. Americans saw that
Trump made the American people see that?
Well, I think Americans saw it already.
Okay.
They saw their jobs going overseas.
Trump pointed it out, though.
He pointed it out. He was one of the few people who pointed it out.
Right.
But they knew it. They had seen it already.
Okay.
They had seen their jobs get moved overseas. So when Trump said we're making bad trade deals and we have to hold China to account, they thought there's a guy speaking common sense. We like that about him. And so he ran for office on what? Immigration, right? People saw the effects of illegal immigration, and he ran on making better trade deals with China. They saw both those things. And so from the top down, he is representing really the people of the United States. And that's something that's not happened in the last 40 years.
Exactly. I was thinking about in Nixon's time. It seems like back then it was more like a top-down instead of a bottom-up. Kissinger and those people.
Yeah, well, foreign policy is rightly in the purview of the president.
Okay.
And so it's going to be top-down quite often.
Okay.
And so Nixon thought strategically it made sense to open up relations with the PRC. He wanted to, in his own mind, play the PRC against the Soviet Union, the so-called China card. And so it made strategic sense at the time. I think Henry Kissinger didn't quite have all that right and went too far. But what was the hope back then? The hope was we were going to open relations with the PRC, there was going to be economic freedom, and then that would lead to political freedom. Okay, there was a great deal of economic freedom, but we haven't had the political freedom.
Right.
Quite the opposite.
Right.
The Chinese Communist Party has become more powerful, more sophisticated, more capable of managing, enslaving, tyrannizing, however you want to frame it, 1.4 billion people. They've gotten really good at it. Now, they've done it at a time when they're also pretty good at developing a modern economy. And the Chinese people are hardworking. And, they have a lot of flaws in their economic system, I believe. But they're a capable people, the Chinese. And I think American policymakers have not understood that. They've not appreciated that China is a great nation with a hardworking, inventive people who are very determined to become the preeminent power on earth. Americans meet Chinese people and they think they're just like us, because they mostly are, right? Americans meet Chinese people in this country and they think they're just like us. They're nice, everyday people. They're smiling. They're happy. They're hardworking.
Okay.
They don't see the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, I think they probably haven't seen how the Chinese Communist Party has transformed the Chinese people quite a bit.
Right.
And
right. We see the Chinese people, not the Chinese Communist Party, and all they've done.
Yes.
And Trump, President Trump, has understood that it's the Chinese Communist Party that is leading a group of people to do everything that we see, whether it's bad trade deals or the theft of intellectual property, the default on their sovereign debt, the building of islands in the South China Sea, this Belt and Road Initiative, an ambition to go around the world in an economic way and to become, again, the preeminent power on earth. That's an ambition we haven't seen before. It went from almost nowhere on the public stage to...
It was hidden.
It was hidden, right? Yeah. And now it's very prominent, and President Trump, thankfully, is challenging that and I think been very effective in doing so.
President Reagan said, communism is like a virus. And I think with virus, you only have two ways to deal with it. You either kill it or you stay away from it. George Kennan also said, America should minimize its engagement with China. Hardly any administration since the Nixon's time has done this. And now things are different. People are talking about China threat all the time. But still, to say the two economies should decouple is somehow politically incorrect. Do you agree? And what do you think is the right way to do it?
It's very difficult to decouple the economy, our economy, from the PRCs. But as you suggest, it's very difficult to keep them coupled. If what the United States does is produce intellectual property and goods in a consumer-based economy, and the Chinese are determined to steal our intellectual property and not allow us access to their markets, how can we keep the economies coupled? As painful as decoupling would be, there's a certain injustice to keeping them together. There's a certain injustice, and in American politics, there's still a question of justice always.
Right.
Is there a right? Is there a right and wrong?
That's the center of the politics. Nobody talks about it anymore.
Right. And so it's unjust to keep the American people coupled with an economy, with the PRC, that is stealing their wealth on a daily basis. And so as painful as decoupling is, it may be the right thing to do. Now, how you do that's a different thing. The president right now is doing his best, I believe, to see whether or not he can create a regime that will enforce the protection of intellectual property. That may or may not work. That's what he's, in a way, it's what he's betting his presidency on. And so we're in these big trade talks.
Right.
And on the one hand, he says they're going great. On the other hand, we may wait till after the election. And so it's part of the art of the deal. I believe the president's going to make a strong deal. And he wouldn't make a weak deal.
Yeah.
He wouldn't make it because, one, he's a smart guy and he's not going to make a bad deal. But two, if he did make a bad deal, guess who would brag about it? The communists.
Right.
The communists would brag about making a bad deal. Because at the end of the day, the president may have good relations with President Xi. At the end of the day, this is a tough business. Right? The president said that. This is a tough business. And President Xi is going to do whatever he can for the good of the CCP and the PRC. And President Trump's going to do everything he can to defend the United States. That may ultimately require decoupling, just as a practical matter. We would like to be joined with the PRC in free and open trade, protection of intellectual property, but that doesn't look like it's a likely scenario. And also the PRC, I think, they don't want Trump reelected.
No, definitely
I mean,
not.
President Trump is the last person President Xi wants reelected.
Right, although they talk about friendship all the time. Even Xi Jinping talked about, oh, I'm a good friend with President Trump.
Right,
but
right. Well, I think, it's funny. I think the way, I'm sure on a personal level, they probably admire each other.
Right.
On a personal level, they
Yes.
both got to be the president
Yeah.
of a great nation. Now, when it comes to real life and real politics, President Trump doesn't want President Xi ruling over a communist dictatorship. President Xi doesn't want President Trump and those America First foreign policies. President Trump is committed to fixing the problems associated with globalization. He's promised to fix that. That's what America First is all about. Well, that's the last thing President Xi wants.
Right.
And so for that reason alone, I think it's very unlikely that we're going to get a good trade deal here.
Right, exactly.
Because a good trade deal would mean that President Trump succeeded, and that would be a reason for him to get reelected. President Xi could not want that.
No.
And so that's why these trade negotiations have been so problematic over the last 18 months.
If you think about these things, if you really think about the trade talk and trade deal, and I often ponder whether time is on the American side or on the Chinese side. And I think, I mean, many people think American has a stronger economy. China exports more. That's one thing. But the other thing is, if in the end, U.S. and China would not make a trade deal because China wouldn't do the structural changes that you talked about, and then, would it be better if the two economies decouple right now instead of maybe a year or 2 years later? Because by that time, U.S. capital are still investing in Chinese companies. So the two economies will be intertwined, it would be coupled even more. By that time, even if you wanted to couple, you may not have an opportunity. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think we've never had this kind of problem either, have we?
No.
We've never had this kind of relationship with any other nation. We were not heavily invested economically with Nazi Germany. We were not heavily invested with the Soviet Union. Here we have a case where we have a nation who themselves, with Communist China, they see themselves as an enemy of the United States. They believe themselves in an economic and political war with the United States. They say that in their own writings. President Xi says as much in his speeches. Now, he says all that, and they write all that within their military writings and some of their political writings, at a time when they're also asking U.S. companies and U.S. citizens to be investing in Communist China.
Right.
So it's a very odd situation we find ourselves in. And Wall Street has done the very odd thing of joining with the PRC to encourage such investment. And they're opposed to President Trump and the trade deal and any kind of restrictions on capital flows. You saw former Secretary of the Treasury Hank Paulson give a speech saying basically it would be a disaster if we decoupled our economies. And he's very worried, he says, about anything that would cause any kind of restrictions on Americans investing in Chinese corporations. Well, think about that for a moment. So we have a master of Wall Street telling us we ought to be investing our money, we the American people, our money in Communist China. Well, when we invest in Communist China, we're investing and we're betting on their success.
Right.
So do we want a communist dictatorship to succeed? And when we invest in their state-owned enterprises, that's what we're betting on. Now, that seems to me only possible when people are intellectually and morally corrupt. Because the good of the American people, their economic security and their physical security, requires that they're investing in things that are to their own benefit and to their own good. And the success of the Communist Party in China is not in their interest. And so it's a very odd situation we find ourselves in today when so many among our elites have this very confused, and as I say, I think there's only one way to look at it. It's corrupt. It's corrupt to think that you can do business with Communist China when Communist China positions itself as an economic and political enemy of the United States. That's their words, not ours.
I don't know if I'm characterizing history right, but I think historically the West, market economy and capitalism has not been very effective in defending its values against the CCP, against the communist ideology or infiltration. So the CCP is actually the exporter of its ideology. The West is more like an importer of CCP's ideology. It's not vice versa. What do you think?
Well, we're a very trusting people.
Okay.
We want to see good in people.
Right.
It's part of the American nature. We look at people and we tend not to judge you on where you're from. We think that if you're doing business with us, that we both want a good deal. We want to make things and sell them to you. You want to make things, sell them to us. We think it's just a good deal. We tend not, it's not about defending our values per se. We defend our values, but we can get fooled
Get fooled, yeah.
all the time by people. And we trust people. And we think that...
I think that's the
Yeah.
average American. So, I mean, those Wall Street people, I think they know a lot of the truth about China, but they don't care.
No, I think they don't care.
Right.
And they think China can abuse human rights. It's not on, not on our back. It's not our fault that they want to abuse human rights. And there's not a whole lot the United States can do to pressure communist China to try to change their system of government. That's a very difficult thing to do. But at minimum, we don't want to be investing in their success.
Right.
And so when American dollars are going to be invested in communist China, we're strengthening the Chinese Communist Party. We're strengthening their ability to abuse the human rights of the people of China or Hong Kong or elsewhere around the world. At minimum, we don't want to be doing that. At maximum, we want to be an example of freedom and liberty for the world. I mean, it's often said or remarked that the United States is friends of freedom everywhere, but guardians only of our own. That's a shorthand of John Quincy Adams and his formulations about American foreign policy. So, we're not going to go invade China and change them. But we can at least be an example of the rule of law and freedom and democracy here, because that's what we do. But we also don't want to be doing the kind of things economically that would strengthen the Communist Party. And today, Wall Street is complicit with them to make sure that we do that. Because I think they believe, to the extent that we can get the economies intertwined, that it'll be good for globalization.
Right.
Now, it may not be good for America, but it'll be good for communist China, and it'll be good for their bankers on Wall Street.
Right. It's good for their wallet.
Right. But not good for the freedom of the people of China, and not ultimately good for the freedom of the people of the United States.
Right.
When American investors have 20% of their portfolio invested in communist China or Chinese, both sovereign debt and debt of their state-owned enterprises and stocks, within their state-owned enterprises, when they're invested that way, it'll be very hard for an American president to put any pressure on the PRC at all.
It's impossible, I think.
I think you're right, because it would be an immediate hit to the retirement funds
Yes.
of the American citizens.
Right.
And so that's not going to happen. And Wall Street knows that, and the PRC knows that, which is why they're pushing so hard for it.
Right. So I think long term, if this, at least this decoupling from the American capital market is not done, I think the time is on China's side. As long as they keep the two economies, keep the Wall Street money coming, they're set.
Oh, I think you're right.
Right.
I think you're right. At the end of the day, however, Americans care a lot about freedom.
Right.
We care about money. We need money to live, right? We need jobs, we need businesses, what have you. But what the Chinese don't understand about us is that what matters the most is human freedom.
Yeah.
We will fight and die for human freedom. We will fight and die for our freedom. And so we have to make sure that they always understand that the United States is not all about money. We're about freedom. And I think when President Trump is talking about rebuilding the American military, building a space force, and doing the kind of things economically to check their ambition, I think they see a different kind of America than they've seen in the past 40 years. They see a seriousness that they haven't seen before. And that's not about money. That's about freedom. Everything President Trump has done is mostly about freedom, right? These trade deals, these tariffs, they cause a hit to the economy at some level. And President Trump has explained to people there'll be some short-term pain. Yes, we're getting money from tariffs from some of these agricultural deals, but still there's some short-term pain here. And President Trump has said we're going to have to go through that in order to get this economic relationship back in balance.
Right.
And so I think that's going to happen. Or you will see the kind of decoupling you're suggesting.
Right.
And it will be, at that point, just common sense. It won't be anything beyond that.
Yeah.
But it's a very interesting time in American history to see that a president's willing to do that. Because everybody before him, and I fear many presidents after him, all they believe in is globalization and globalism more broadly.
Right.
And they see a whole bunch of money to be made, but at the end of the day, money is not enough. Money cannot buy you freedom.
Right. That's so important. I think that's where the communist regime has the fundamental misunderstanding of the American people. They think that the American people can be bought by money. They fundamentally didn't understand the value of freedom.
It's funny, they don't understand it even in Hong Kong,
They don't.
right? I mean, I think the communist Chinese have made a huge mistake in Hong Kong. That I think they thought the people of Hong Kong were just going to put their heads down and do whatever they said. And they didn't. They kept on protesting. Because the communists in Beijing did not understand that once you insert freedom into the hearts of people, it is a powerful thing.
Right.
And they're going to keep on protesting.
Right.
And I don't know what's going to happen in Hong Kong, but I do know that the people of Hong Kong, having tasted, experienced, lived freedom all these years, are, I think, going to continue to fight for it. The U.S. government is going to support the idea of freedom there, and I'm encouraged in a way by the whole experience we've seen in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Partly because you see that the communist Chinese, President Xi, what have you, they got it wrong. They're not perfect. They don't get this right every time. They make mistakes. And they made, I think, in Hong Kong, a big political mistake. Because Americans look at that and they think, there's something wrong there.
Yeah, the fundamental reason is just they don't understand freedom.
No, they don't.
Right.
Well, in a way you might say either they don't understand freedom or they understand it completely. And they want tyranny instead. They want their communist dictatorship. Because what matters most to the Chinese Communist Party is the power and control of the Chinese Communist Party. They understand, I think, maybe in a way, to come full circle, they understand that freedom's a dangerous thing.
Right.
And they need to put that down. They need complete control. And so, you saw Mayor Bloomberg recently talked about President Xi. President Xi has to appeal to all his constituencies within China. Who misunderstands freedom there, right?
He really said that.
Yeah. No, it was a certain naivete.
Okay.
But he thinks all politics are just alike.
Okay.
Democratic politics, communist politics. It's all just politics. When at the end of the day, in communist China, they have perfected, unfortunately, or at least very good at, suppressing political dissent and doing whatever it takes to make China into the communist power they want it to be.
Right.
And I think American policymakers don't fully appreciate that because they look at China and they see all the wealth, right? And they see all the economic growth, manufacturing, etc. So we tend to think of them kind of like us.
Right.
We think everybody just wants, to have make money, have a nice life, what have you.
That's so natural. I can't put the blame on American people.
No, I can't either.
This is what humans should be.
Yes, I can't either.
Right.
It's the American elites that I blame for not seeing the dangers imposed or presented to the United States by the Chinese Communist Party. And I think the real thing that the president's been pushing on, which has been so important, is this intellectual property piece. Because here you have a president. Where's our intellectual property produced in this country? You might say it's produced all over the country, but it's primarily produced in California, New York, Massachusetts, a few other places. But California, New York, Massachusetts, they didn't vote for President Trump, right?
No.
But yet he's willing to stake his entire presidency on defending their intellectual property rights,
Right.
because that's the intellectual property and wealth of the American people.
Yes.
And that's a remarkable thing. Here's a president who's staked his entire, 4 years, 8 years, what have you,
Yeah.
on holding China to account when it comes to the theft of intellectual property. Even though the states where it's produced, they didn't vote for him, he's going to do it anyway,
Yeah.
because it's the right thing to do. It's the common sense thing to do.
Let's talk about, you are the president of American Strategy Group.
Right,
It's
right.
a think tank
Right.
exploring the existential threat America faces today.
Right.
I think for a lot of the American people and for non-American people, America is still the most powerful country in the planet.
Right.
And technologically, economically, and otherwise. And why do you think America faces existential threat?
Well, partly because you have countries like communist China. And I think we can't discount Russia. Russia has nuclear weapons.
Okay.
And you have the Islamic world,
Okay.
and the Muslim Brotherhood and where it operates. And we've been fighting all of these things. Most of our failings, at least when it comes to the existential threats, are intellectual. We didn't understand that the Soviet Union was an existential threat until well into the 50s and 60s, when we realized, oh, they have nuclear weapons too. And again, we're a commercial republic, so we think about producing things, selling things around the world. We ask everyday Americans to go raise their families, work hard, go to church on Sunday, and be private citizens. We don't ask them to worry about national security problems. At the American Strategy Group, and before that when I was with the Claremont Institute, we thought that there was a challenge there, that if you don't realize you have a threat, you may not prepare for one. And that communist China today, they are building very advanced nuclear weapons. They have an air force that has become very sophisticated. American policymakers tend to think of China as kind of backwards or still developing when it comes to their military arsenal. Their, fourth and fifth generation fighter jets are among the most sophisticated in the world.
Really? Okay.
They have a very large navy, the largest in the world, that is becoming ever more sophisticated. They have space capabilities. And you combine that with an ideology that says they want to be the preeminent power on Earth. Well, by definition, they present an existential threat.
I see.
When you read these books like Unrestricted Warfare, back from 1999, where you had these two colonels describe all the things that could be done against the United States in order to defeat the United States, you see a mindset within communist China that would suggest, not today, not tomorrow, but someday, we may need to do whatever it takes to destroy the United States. Now, I'm not saying they want to, but there may come a time. And to the extent that they think that way and they engage in preparations to do that, then we in the United States have to be prepared. But US policymakers don't seem to have an adequate understanding of that. Today, do we have a national missile defense to stop communist China? And the answer is no, we do not. Now, how is that possible? How is it possible, given how technologically advanced the United States is, we do not have a national missile defense to stop either China or Russia?
Really?
So they could launch a nuclear attack on us today, and we're not going to be able to stop it.
Because we were in that agreement, the mid-range missile.
Well, we've been in a number of agreements over the
Right.
years, not with China, but with the Soviet Union.
Right.
Right? We had the anti-ballistic missile treaty. We've
Right.
had various arms treaties dealing with medium-range missiles and what have you. But here we are, most Americans think that if someone shoots a nuclear weapon at us, we're going to be able to shoot it down. Well, no, not the case.
Right.
We may be able to stop a North Korean attack.
But no.
But we can't stop a ship-launched attack. We cannot stop, because they have mobile missiles and a large number, conceivably, in communist China or in Russia, we can't stop those attacks. Now, why not? Because American policymakers did not think it important enough to do that. President Reagan talked about it. President Bush talked about it. President Obama was pretty much opposed to it. President Trump is for it.
So that's why President Trump exited out the treaty, right, with Soviet Union.
Well, he thought that's a treaty that is only confusing Americans. They're not abiding by it. Russians aren't abiding by it.
Right.
We may need to build nuclear weapons. We're getting out of the treaty.
Right.
The president does believe in missile defense, but Congress has not appropriated the funds and committed to the kind of program that we need to actually defend the United States. The president's talked about the need for a space force.
Right.
Now, he's talked about it in part because China's building one,
Yeah.
and the Russians are building one. Okay, well, it's good that the president has committed to that, but he has either 1 more year or 5 more years to get this done. Because again, he believes in it, and I'm fully supportive of him in those beliefs, but it has to get done, and it has to get done soon. Because if we don't do it now, it's not going to get done. Because other U.S. presidents have again, just talked about it, but not carried through. There's something fundamentally immoral about having the United States vulnerable today to a ballistic missile from North Korea, Communist China, Russia, Iran, or anyone. We should be able to defend the United States. We have the capability. What we lack is the political will. And so when you have a country that lacks the political will to defend itself, there's something wrong. And so at the American Strategy Group, our whole idea was, can you explain to Americans this, as it were, lack of common sense? The common sense thing to do is to build a missile defense to stop enemies who want to destroy you. Even if it was an accidental launch, let's just say, you'd want to be able to stop that.
Right.
Today we don't have that. And so to the extent that you explain that to Americans, if I said what I said to the everyday Americans, they would say, that's crazy, that's outrageous. How do we not have a missile defense? How much does it cost? And the cost to build a pretty robust system is about $30 billion. Now,
that's not very much at all.
That's not very much. In a way, it's not enough. In a way, here in Washington, when you're talking about spending billions and trillions on something, people get interested. It's only 30 billion.
Oh.
And so the military, we'll call it the military industrial complex, doesn't get that excited about it. But in fact, you need one. You need all sorts of defenses against all sorts of challenges. We need better cruise missile defense. We need better ships. We need better planes. We need all these things if we're going to discourage communist China or Russia or Iran or anyone else from thinking they can destroy the United States. We have a great deal of security now during President Trump because he's a serious man about this. But after President Trump, I fear that the country, if it's not led by someone with equal seriousness, will fall back into this intellectual trap of believing, well, we'll never have another big war.
Right.
That we'll just have these little problems around the globe. When in fact, the history of the world is major conflict and nations making gross strategic errors.
Right.
And getting into wars when they didn't mean to get into wars. And I fear a day will come when some nation, like I've just described, thinks the United States, they need to go. They need to be taken down a peg. We're the preeminent power on earth. And so that's the concern I and my colleagues have for not taking national security seriously enough.
Right. I understand the material risks you talked about. When we say existential threats America faces today, do you think America also faces an existential threat to, how would you say, the very identity of who she is?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's even more, in a way, that's equally important. You see in this country multiculturalism having a very pernicious effect on what it means to be an American. Just the idea of Americanism, that you believe in human freedom, that you believe in the rule of law, that you believe all men are created equal, the kind of things our founders talked about
Right.
in the Declaration of Independence and in our Constitution. That's being lost. And in our universities, we're told that America was a country by white men, for white men, morally corrupt from the time of the founding, and that it really isn't a very good place to live. That the things that it means to be an American are inherently bad things. Now that's what gets taught, I'm exaggerating, but not by much. That gets taught in American schools and universities. Now, most Americans hear that and they think, I think America's a pretty good place. They go outside and they work hard and they raise their families and they go to church and, they lead pretty good lives. I mean, we're the freest country on earth and then the richest country on earth.
Right.
And why are we the richest? Because we're the freest. The human beings, when they're allowed to be free, can do a whole bunch of things to make themselves wealthy and to work hard.
Exactly.
And so that's the genius of America. And yet we're teaching our young people that they don't live in a good country anymore. And the real existential threat, they're told, is global warming, or homophobia, or transgenderophobia, or any one of a number of problems. These are the real threats, we're told. Not other countries, but the real problem is you Americans who believe in America and believe in a natural morality or traditional morality or, a Judeo-Christian kind of belief system. That's the problem. And to the extent that Americans hear those kind of things, I think they think Washington and our university system is out of touch. Because most Americans live by common sense. And they know they live in a good country. And they know that our men and women in our armed forces are doing good things and defending our freedom. Go to a football game on a Friday night. And you see a whole bunch of good people who have spent all week working and now want to watch a football game and watch their sons play football. I was just on one on the weekend out in California. And there's a whole bunch of happy people who I think love their families and love their country. And that's what's great about our country.
So you think there's still hope, or a very strong hope, or America is going to come back for that tradition?
I do.
Okay.
Because that love of freedom, again, once you get that in your heart, people are going to do a lot to keep it.
Right.
And that's what President Trump was tapping into when he talked about making America great again.
All right.
He was tapping into that fundamental belief in American greatness.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simone.